rushed, crowded, complicated days at the United Nations, so I'm just running between meetings, but very delighted to be together with you right now. And as usual, we have a lot of great questions, and I'm going to go straight to the questions, starting with Elke Schnabel, who asks about the poverty of data. How to obtain reliable data in developing countries. Data and development statistics are the basis for sustainable development. What can be done to obtain and control data, especially from developing countries, adequate to international standards? Let me give you a very specific and, for me, rather frustrating example of this. The number one Millennium Development Goal, literally MDG 1 or MDG 1A, is to reduce extreme poverty by half by the year 2015. Remember how that Millennium Development Goal is defined. The World Bank sets a measure. The measure is $1.25 per person per year, $1.25 per day per person per year. Sorry, $1.25 per person per day, averaged over a year of observation there, using international prices, 2005 prices. And at that standard, you measure from that poverty line the percentage of individuals below the poverty line. And when that was measured for developing countries as a whole in 1990, it was 43%. Actually, it's measured household by household, and then based on the household demographic structure, poverty is assigned at the individual level. So in 1990, the World Bank estimated that 43% of the population of developing countries was under the poverty line. And the goal, therefore, is that by 2015, this should fall by half, meaning at least by half, meaning that by 2015, it should be below 21.5% of the population. Now, the good news is that as of 2010, the World Bank estimated that the poverty rate defined by this $1.25 per day had in fact declined already to 21%. So the goal of cutting poverty by half had been achieved by 2010, 5 years ahead of schedule. What are the problems? The problems are now we're towards the end of 2014, and we don't have any data since that 2010 announcement. The World Bank just hasn't produced updated data. And what's also true is that we're interested not only in that global statistic, but we're interested in national level data as well. And it's even worse. Just year by year, we don't have the data. Now, this is quite strange and disappointing in my view, given that Google knows more about us minute by minute or second by second than the World Bank seems to know about us on a 5-year interval. So we need a big push for quality, accurate data that's timely. And the Sustainable Development Goals will not succeed unless we have timely, annual, sustainable development data, at least on the national basis, if not on subnational bases of cities, for instance. The UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network that I direct on behalf of UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is therefore making a big, insistent push. We need to upgrade the data systems dramatically. We need timely, relevant, quantitative data around all of the sustainable development challenges: public health, education, water and sanitation, climate change, biodiversity, poverty levels, gender inequalities, and so forth. And we need them annually, because if we don't have that, we can't really steer the system. Now, this is in discussion at the UN right now. It would require significant investment, probably hundreds of millions of dollars more in data collection and management for good governance. And we really need that. It's expensive to make good data, but it's really worth it because the ability, therefore, to make good policies and to know how a set of goals is or is not rolling out is vitally dependent on the timeliness and the quality of the data. So Elke, a good question, exactly right on track, and what we're trying to push. Next question is from Mauro Zenteno. It says, Mexico's crossing the worst crisis in terms of violence and human rights violation. In this context, what's the way to rebuild social tissue looking for a sustainable society? Oh, can we ask some simple questions? This is not easy at all. First of all, the Americas as a whole are quite violent. The United States, Mexico, Central America, parts of South America like Colombia have traditionally had the highest homicide rates in the world. Lots of guns, lots of inequality of wealth, lots of inequality of power by ethnic groups and racial groups. And the result has been traditionally a lot of violence. I sometimes describe the Americas as conquest societies, you could say conquistadores societies, because the Americas were conquered in essence by the European settlers after Columbus. Native Americans had settled North and South America around 13,000 years ago. They were more or less left alone by the rest of the world, as far as we know, except for one brief encounter when the Vikings reached Newfoundland around 1000 AD. But then when Columbus landed in Hispaniola in the Caribbean in 1492 on the island that is now Haiti and Dominican Republic, there began a period of 300 years of European conquest and of bringing slaves African slaves into the Americas. And what evolved was a very, very stratified, unequal societies divided by race, with the power held generally in the hands of the European descendants. The Native Americans in many places wiped out violently. Of course, slave descendants among the poorest parts of society, and a tradition of violence. Violence on the frontier, violence to maintain power, violence to instill fear in populations, and a spread of guns. That's the long history in a short, in a nutshell. But with Mexico today, there's definitely an added feature, and that is the illegal trade in narcotics that are moving from South America, principally the Andean region, especially cocaine, through transit points, including Mexico, because of the Mexican-U.S. border, into the vast U.S. market, where there's a massive drug addiction and demand for cocaine, marijuana, and other smuggled narcotics. Well, this is fighting the marketplace, and it's being done in a military way. And it's hard to beat the market under any circumstances, but it's proven to be extraordinarily difficult to beat the market here. But who's bearing the brunt of this war on drugs, so-called? Mexico, Central America, transit points, which have become sites of incredible violence, major drug gangs with huge weaponry available, and brutality that is really beyond description, shocking. And it's so destabilized societies in Central America and in Mexico that it's also led to mass migration into the US. And this past year, the migration of young children who are sent by parents or who escape on their own trying to save their lives from gang warfare in Mexico and in Central America. All of this suggests that there are some very, very deep aspects of this violence, which goes to the questions of social inequality. And I would say that highly unequal societies tend to be more violent societies. And then it goes to the dynamics of world markets in illegal trade, whether it's in narcotics or in other kinds of smuggled and illegal goods, or in sex trafficking and so forth. You have a lot of violence around this because it's an illegal activity that is defended by private gangs who take away the government's monopoly of power in the interests of massive private profits. So, Mauro, no easy answer again, except we need a different approach to the problem of drug addiction. It should be decriminalized to an important extent. We should deprive the gangs of their huge profit rents that come through this kind of militarized approach. We should take a public health approach to drug use, trying to discourage it through mass public education and to help addicts not by locking them up in jail as we do in the United States, but rather through public health measures. It's not perfect, but I think it would diminish at least one part of the incredible violence that is ripping apart Mexico, but also Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and many other countries as well. So we have a question from Hoang Nhu Kien, I hope. Perhaps from Vietnam, judging by the name. How can we spread the idea of sustainable development in developing countries? Oh, there we are, specifically in Vietnam. We are now focusing on economics by investing in oil and gas refineries. This, of course, impacts on the environment and is not seriously assessed. So, Hong, the basic idea of the Sustainable Development Goals is precisely to help Vietnam and other societies to be more holistic in the development strategy. If you leave things to the marketplace, then the driver of development is money, profits, and usually with a very short-sighted view about profits and not taking into account social costs and not taking into account inequalities of income and wealth and not taking into account the fragility of the natural environment. And so Sustainable Development Goals aim to be the answer to your question, Hung. How can we spread the idea of sustainable development? Well, if there are SDGs, if there are Sustainable Development Goals that are at the center of shared global objectives, we at least have a chance to bring the ideas of sustainable development to the forefront. Even better if we can show practical approaches to sustainable development, ways that it's possible for Vietnam to develop, but without the massive pollution of the air and the water, or ways for the world economy to grow, but without the increasing fossil fuel emissions that are causing planetary climate mayhem, then we can make the case also to the public far more satisfactorily that here is a way that things can work. Here is a way that we can move forward. And that's the purpose of the SDGs. And you as a student in this course are ambassadors for the SDGs. Let me be clear. we are going to sign them in less than a year now. Every part of the world should sign up to these new Sustainable Development Goals. In the coming months, I think there will be lots of announcements about how this is evolving, and we should take the opportunity, even before the goals are formally adopted in September 2015, to get your fellow students, the universities, civil society, and government sensitized to the idea that a healthy society requires a sustainable development framework. So here's a question from Corrado Quinto. One of your recommendations is about reinforcing the fight against malaria. Do you think the Global Fund to fight against AIDS, TB, and malaria is an efficient tool in this sense? Great question, Corrado, and as you can gather from the lectures, one of my favorite topics. Malaria, like Ebola, or like AIDS, or like many diseases of lung infections or of diarrheal disease, is an infectious disease. It's caused by a pathogen, in this case, a unicellular organism, Plasmodium, that infects individuals and is spread, in the case of malaria, by a insect vector. A vector means a means of spreading an infectious disease by another organism. Anopheles mosquitoes bite somebody with malaria, draw the blood from them, take in the Plasmodium, that is the pathogen that causes the disease, and then a couple of weeks later bite somebody else and put that pathogen into the bloodstream of another individual, thereby spreading the infection. So malaria can be controlled by stopping these mosquito bites, for example. Malaria can also be treated by medicines that combat the ill effects of the pathogens. So malaria is a kind of disease where you can both stop the transmission of the disease through various means, including insecticide-treated bed nets, and where you can cure what is otherwise often a fatal disease by giving the right kind of medicine in a timely way. Usually it's required within 24 hours of the onset of the high fever and other symptoms of malaria. Now, malaria a few years ago was killing about 1.5 million people per year, 90% of whom are in Africa. And by now, that number has come down roughly by half to perhaps 700,000 per year. Big achievement. Why did malaria come down? It came down because programs like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria provided the financing to governments to buy bed nets, medicines, and diagnostic tests to help them control the disease. This is essentially what we need to do for success in any of these infectious diseases, Ebola included. While there isn't a simple medicine to treat Ebola, like the case of malaria, to stop an Ebola epidemic, we need to stop the transmission of the disease from one infected person to another person who becomes infected. And in the case of Ebola, that's done mainly by physical isolation of the infected individual in a safe ward in a hospital where the infected person is getting treatment, but also is being kept away from the rest of the population so that the disease is not spreading. What's the problem? At a technical level, there isn't a huge problem. At an operational level, there is a huge problem. Whether it's malaria or Ebola, these cases are taking place largely in remote rural areas, places where there aren't doctors, nurses, and clinics, places where there aren't ambulances, places where traditional means of diagnosis, which in the case of Ebola is pretty involved. It's a PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, to look at the genetics to see whether this virus, this filovirus that causes Ebola, is actually inside the body of the feverish person. And so to do the diagnostics, the hospitalization, the case identification, which means that when someone's sick in a community, someone with skill comes to look at them to make a diagnosis. All of that requires financial resources to be turned into human resources of trained personnel, and to be turned into capital resources like PCR machines or wards on a hospital, or the protective gear that individuals need in the health sector so that they can attend to the infected individuals without the health workers themselves getting sick. Now, the problem is very poor countries don't have those resources. And either they get international help from programs like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, or they suffer. And when they suffer, the disease spreads to others as well. My basic argument is that it's crazy for us worldwide to leave very poor people without access to even a rudimentary primary health system. If you do that, these infections will spread. They will also spread to the high-income world. Lots of people will die unnecessarily. There will be lots of panic. There will be lots of loss of economic activity. For instance, in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea right now, the mining sector is closed down to a large extent, and agriculture is hugely disrupted, and people are going hungry because of the lack of control of the epidemic. So the answer, Corrado, is yes, the Global Fund makes a big difference, but no, it does not have enough money to function. And when it has tried to replenish that money, it couldn't find one of the $1 billion a year that it said it needed. It raised so far $4 billion per year, but said it needed $5 billion as the absolute minimum. But what's $1 billion per year among friends? Think of it this way: there are 1 billion people if you add up the populations of the United States, Canada, Europe, and Japan. 1 billion people in the rich countries. If each of us in the rich countries gave just $1 per year, half the cost of a cup of coffee at a Starbucks, you'd collect $1 billion that could then be deployed to keeping vast numbers of people alive. But the world has a very hard time, it seems, caring enough to raise even these modest amounts of money. And so even when programs work like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, they don't get proper funding. And you hear all sorts of silly, but worse than silly, really destructive claims by pretty ignorant congressmen and senators in the United States. They don't want to spend money on foreign aid. It's all a waste. Well, if their child were even one day in an African village without health care, all they would do all day is try to raise money to make sure that there was protection. But they don't think in those terms. And so the US and many other donor countries do not give even tiny amounts that they should be to be able to meet the broad global challenges of the poorest people in the world. Now, the United States has helped fund specifically the fight against AIDS, TB, and malaria, but it could do a lot more than it's doing, and should be doing a lot more than it's doing. Here's a related question from Richard Patrick. It is unclear if our country, the United States, or the rest of the world has the political will to address climate change. How do you see the role of adaptation affecting sustainable development? I don't quite want to go there yet in the following sense. When we think about climate change, we need to think about two dimensions of climate change. The first is mitigation. Mitigation means reducing the amount of human-caused climate change. And as we know, the main way to mitigate climate change is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And remember that the main greenhouse gas emissions is carbon dioxide, followed way behind by methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorine gases. So the main way to mitigate is through reducing CO2 emissions. And the main way to reduce CO2 emissions is to shift from high carbon energy of coal, oil, and gas to low carbon energy like wind, solar, or nuclear power, or geothermal and hydropower. Okay, so before we get on to anything else, we should figure out how we're going to find the political will to mitigate the human impact. But Richard asked about adaptation. That's the second component of responding to climate change. That means learning to live with climate change more effectively, making it less destructive and less risky. And certainly any sane strategy for climate change will have both mitigation and adaptation. I could say one thing for sure. If we give up on mitigation, say, oh, we're just going to burn as much coal, oil, and gas as we want to, and not pay any attention to it, the adaptation mechanisms will not be able to cope. Because if we follow a strict business as usual path for using fossil fuels, the emissions levels will increase so much, that temperature will increase so much, that we will face disruptions of the food supply, the water cycle, the storm cycle, that will be so severe that adaptation will not be able to offset the growing risks. So if we don't mitigate, we're not going to be able to adapt. But let me put it the other way. What if we do effective mitigation? Would that mean that we could forget about adaptation because we would have stopped climate change? Absolutely not. Because even if we follow a very effective mitigation strategy right now, and effective would mean taking strong steps to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius compared to the temperature in the pre-industrial era and the current temperature. In other words, to stop the warming of more than 2 degrees Celsius on a worldwide average. Even if we did that, there would still be a lot of climate change. There would still be a lot of climate shocks to our economy. Droughts, floods, heat waves, rising ocean levels, loss of biodiversity. So much so that even if we succeed in honoring the 2 degrees Celsius upper limit on human-induced climate change, we're going to have a lot of adaptation to do. So what's my bottom line on the first part of my answer to Richard? It is we have to both mitigate and adapt. Absolutely. Then Richard asks, well, what about political will? It all depends who you ask. My political will, very strong. Most Americans' political will, actually not bad when they answer opinion surveys. The political will of ExxonMobil or of Chevron, so far non-existent. Their political will seems to be to use political lobbying and campaign contributions to pretend that climate change isn't a serious issue. And so we face a real political situation, which is that most people want to take action because they know that the current trajectory of the world is dangerous. But a few groups in society are resisting action. And you might think that the few groups wouldn't be able to have their say, except when the few groups are big oil, big coal, and big gas. They're very powerful, probably the most powerful political lobby in the whole world. The will of different countries obviously also differs. If you're a big fossil fuel producing country, you probably are facing a lot of lobbying pressure against climate change action. If you are a big fossil fuel importing country, you tend to be much more interested in developing alternatives to fossil fuels, low carbon alternatives such as solar power and wind power. So will we negotiate successfully an agreement at COP21 next December 2015 in Paris? Can't guess. Not sure. Maybe yes, maybe no. The European Union has already said we're in, and they've set strong targets for decarbonizing the European energy system. President Obama has said the US wants to be in, but hasn't put down a plan yet. The congressional elections we just had in the United States were won by the big oil and gas interests. And so our congressional politics will be against an agreement right now. In China, there is much more will to an agreement than in the past, partly because the coal is absolutely polluting China's air and water so much that the Chinese public knows that it's quite urgent to move to cleaner energy sources. Will it add up to an agreement? It could, but it's going to be a close call. And this is a closely related question from Una Constantinescu. Professor Sachs, how do I comment on the European Union's recent agreement to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030? Is it doable? Some say it leaves too much room for voluntary action. What's my opinion? I think on the whole, Europe remains in the lead on global climate change. Europe is of course, very sophisticated world-leading economy, but it's also a net fossil fuel importing economy. It depends mostly on imports of gas, oil, and coal, actually, to run the economy. And so the interest groups of the fossil fuel industry in Europe are weaker than the same interest groups in the US or Russia or other major fossil fuel producing countries. That's why Europe has said, we're going to get hammered by climate change, and we don't produce all that much greenhouse gas emissions. We want to bring this under control, and Europe's been absolutely right in this. It's been the big fossil fuel producing countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, Russia, the Gulf countries, that have been dragging their feet. That's political economy, because if you're a citizen of the US, Canada, Russia, the Gulf and so forth, then you are vulnerable to human-induced climate change. It's only when it's money in the bank of the oil companies where you have the big pushback. So bravo to the European Union. It's not a perfect agreement, but given that the EU is way out ahead of the US and China, we have to hope that Europe's action of announcing this big reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030 will be an inspiration and a push on the US and China. If the US and China agree to this kind of deep reduction of CO2 emissions, then the three big regions of the world, US, Asia, and Europe, in terms of the world economy, would actually be able to forge a meaningful agreement. Now, let me take one more question for us. So let me find a good one. And I like this one. From Ramit Basu. There was a slogan in 2005, think global, act local. Going by this, what role do I think that local and decentralized government should play in achieving sustainable development, and how can central and national governments better empower them? This is a great question, Ramit. One of the sustainable development goals is likely to be sustainable cities. There will be another for sustainable rural areas. But in essence, the sustainable development goals will push this agenda to the local level. I was just on another video conference moments before with representatives of the city of Detroit. because the city of Detroit is looking at how it can use the new Sustainable Development Goals as they emerge to help promote Detroit's urban development. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in Baltimore for the same purpose, to work with the government and civil society and the universities to help instill the ideas of sustainable development goals at the city level. So local governments need to be champions of sustainable development. That is literally where the rubber meets the road in the traffic in our cities. Cities need transport strategies. They need zoning strategies. They need energy strategies for power generation and distribution, so that the cities become green, clean leaders of sustainable development. I'm very happy that my own city, New York City, and Mayor de Blasio announced at the time of the UN General Assembly in September that New York would take on the goal of reducing by 80% its greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So by mid-century, down by 80%. That's the kind of huge breakthrough we need to be able to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius warming of the planet. New York City's taking the lead. California is also operating with an 80% CO2 reduction target. These are 2 examples, one city, one state, of local governments in the United States taking on the Sustainable Development Challenge. And I think that this needs to be a very general trend. Moving the world towards a new sustainable development trajectory is going to be very hard work. The goals will be one part of it, but then the actions of all parts of society, government, business, civil society, students, scientists, all working towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals will be another part. And when I say government, that will have to be government at all levels, from the local community to the metropolitan area, perhaps to the state level, to the national level, and in many countries, the federal level, say in India, or the US, or Canada, or Russia, or China, or where you have strong provinces or state governments, to the supranational regional level, that is regional associations and groupings like the European Union or the African Union or ASEAN, which coordinate governments across national governments within a geographic region. So this is complicated geometry, a complex variable geometry where the Sustainable Development Goals are going to have to be taken on at all levels. But I believe that cities should take the lead. I encourage every university around the world to say, we're based in a particular place. What is our own community doing to achieve sustainable development? And the universities can convene meetings and seminars and workshops to bring government, business, and civil society together to say, what do the SDGs mean for our own community? So this is one idea that I would like all of you as students to champion. Go to your universities, say, we want to host a meeting about how the Sustainable Development Goals can work for our community. The UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network can give you materials and ideas about how to convene and host such meetings. But what Ramit has asked is precisely the purpose, localizing these goals in a way that local communities, local governments can really take them on in very practical and concrete ways for the people in the community. Well, thank you very, very much for the chance to be with you. Sorry we got started a little bit late. We will post this discussion. I will be tweeting out issues. Please do follow me if you're not following me at Jeff D. Sachs. And hashtag SUSDev for our Age of Sustainable Development course. And we'll be doing another Google Hangout soon. Thank you all very much. Pleasure to be with you today, and have a great day.